Before we begin, imagine giving your whole life to someone you trust, only to have them take everything from you at 63.
That's exactly what happened to her. Her best friend, the one she called family, didn't just betray her. She left her with nothing.
No home, no money, no one to turn to. At an age where most people seek peace, she was forced to start over.
A Korean billionaire stepped into her life. And what he did next changed everything.
Welcome to this story of betrayal, resilience, and an unexpected second chance. Stay with me, because this is something you don't want to miss.
The brass key slid into the deadbolt with a metallic scrape, but it refused to turn. Naomi stood on the sidewalk, the biting December sleet feeling like crushed glass against her cheeks. She jiggled the key. Her fingers, stiff with arthritis and cold, fumbled against the freezing metal. It didn't catch. The internal pins of the lock had been swapped. Through the frosted floor-to-ceiling glass of the marigold room, warmth radiated into the bitter Chicago night. Soft amber pendant lights hung from the exposed brick ceiling, illuminating the velvet banquettes and the sprawling mahogany pastry counter she had sanded and stained with her own hands. Inside, jazz drifted through the high-fidelity speakers. And there, standing by the espresso machine, holding a flute of champagne, was Clara. Clara, the woman who had shared her cramped college dorm room 44 years ago. The woman whose hair Naomi had braided before her wedding, whose hand Naomi had held in the sterile white silence of a hospital room when Clara's husband passed away. Best friends for over 4 decades. Now, Clara was clinking her glass against the rims of 3 men in sharp tailored suits, real estate developers, franchise brokers. Naomi pressed her bare palm against the freezing glass. The shock of the cold didn't register. What registered was the hollow, suffocating vacuum expanding behind her ribs. 6 months ago, when Naomi was drowning in the fog of a severe bout of pneumonia, Clara had brought over a stack of LLC restructuring documents. "It's just administrative, sweetheart," Clara had cooed, adjusting the blankets around Naomi's shivering shoulders. "To protect the tea house's assets while you recover, I'll handle the heavy lifting." Naomi had signed blindly, trusting the woman who held her life's secrets. She hadn't read the fine print that surrendered her controlling shares. She hadn't noticed the clauses that legally downgraded her from founder to an at-will employee. Today, at 63 years old, after pouring 35 years of early mornings, burnt fingertips, and every dime of her savings into building the most celebrated botanical tea house in the Midwest, Naomi had arrived to find a severance check taped to the back door. Clara glanced toward the front window. For a fraction of a second, her eyes locked with Naomi's through the sleet-streaked glass. Clara's smile didn't falter. She simply raised her champagne flute an inch higher, turned her back, and took a sip. The betrayal didn't feel like a stab wound. It felt like a slow-acting poison, paralyzing Naomi's lungs. She didn't scream. She didn't pound on the glass. The absolute finality of Clara's turn back stripped Naomi of her breath. At 63, society already treated her as invisible. Now, the one person who was supposed to see her had erased her completely. Naomi turned away from the window, pulling the collar of her thin wool coat up against the wind. She had $342 in her checking account. Her retirement fund was entirely tied up in the business she no longer owned. The descent into poverty is rarely a dramatic plunge. It is a quiet, humiliating slide. Within 3 months, Naomi lost her 2-bedroom apartment. She sold her copper baking sheets, her vintage record collection, and her car. By the time spring broke, she was living in a damp, windowless basement studio on the far south side, eating plain oatmeal and counting out coins for the laundromat. The job market for a 63-year-old woman with a sudden, unexplained gap in her ownership history was a wasteland of closed doors and polite, condescending rejections. "You're overqualified," they said, which Naomi knew was corporate dialect for "you're too old." Desperation eventually drove her to the service entrance of the Onyx Grand, a sprawling luxury hotel in the heart of downtown. They didn't need a master pastry chef or an executive tea sommelier. They needed a night shift maintenance florist. Minimum wage, no benefits. Shift hours, midnight to 8 in the morning. Naomi took it. She traded her tailored silk blouses for a stiff, scratchy navy blue uniform that smelled faintly of industrial bleach. Her domain was the hotel's crown jewel, a massive glass-domed indoor conservatory that occupied the entire 14th floor. It was a fabricated Eden, lush with imported orchids, weeping figs, and rare tropical ferns. While the city slept, Naomi knelt in the damp soil, her knees aching in protest, pruning dead leaves and checking the pH levels of the irrigation water. She preferred the plants to people. Plants didn't forge documents. Plants didn't smile while they stole your life. If you gave a fern water and light, it grew. The transaction was honest. It was 3:14 a.m. on a Tuesday when the silence of the conservatory was broken. Naomi was deep in the foliage, treating a sprawling Monstera deliciosa for a sudden outbreak of spider mites. She had a spray bottle of diluted neem oil in one hand and a microfiber cloth in the other. A sharp, rhythmic sound echoed against the glass walls. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and heavy. Naomi froze, peeking through the broad green leaves. A man was walking down the slate stone path. He was tall, perhaps in his mid-60s, moving with a quiet, lethal grace. His hair was a thick, striking silver, swept back from a face composed of sharp angles and deep, contemplative lines. He wore a pair of bespoke charcoal trousers and a crisp white dress shirt with the collar unbuttoned and the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing forearms corded with muscle and faint, faded scars. He didn't look like a wandering hotel guest looking for an ice machine. He looked like a man who owned the air he breathed. He stopped in front of a cluster of dying ghost orchids, his hands clasped behind his back, staring at them with a profound, unreadable expression. Naomi stayed perfectly still, holding her breath. The scent of wet earth and sharp neem oil hung heavy in the humid air. Suddenly, without turning his head, the man spoke. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that vibrated through the damp air. "You are cutting too close to the node," he said. Naomi's grip tightened on her spray bottle. She stood up, her aching joints popping in the quiet room. She wiped her dirt-stained hands on her navy trousers, suddenly acutely aware of how disheveled she looked. Her natural hair was tied back under a cheap cotton bandana, her face entirely devoid of makeup, her eyes heavy with the fatigue of the graveyard shift. "Excuse me?" Naomi said, her voice raspy from disuse. The man turned his head. His eyes were dark, piercing, and overwhelmingly intelligent. They scanned her uniform, pausing for a fraction of a second on the embroidered name tag pinned to her chest before meeting her gaze. "The Monstera," he gestured with a long, elegant finger toward the plant she had been working on. "You are stripping the aerial roots. It suffocates the new growth." Naomi felt a sudden, hot flash of professional indignation pierce through her exhaustion. She had cultivated botanical hybrids before this man had likely learned to tie his expensive Italian leather shoes. "I am treating a localized infestation," Naomi said, her tone flat and devoid of customer service deference. "If I don't strip the compromised aerial roots, the mites will travel to the primary vascular tissue and kill the entire system. Sometimes, to save the core, you have to sever what's already rotting." She hadn't meant for it to sound like a metaphor for her own life, but the words hung in the humid air, heavy with unintended grief. The man tilted his head, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his stoic features. He looked at her again, really looked at her this time, past the ugly uniform and the dirt. "You know your botany," he said softly. "I know how to keep things alive in environments designed to kill them," Naomi replied, turning back to the leaves. "Now, unless you need directions back to the elevators, sir, I have a quota to meet before the sun comes up." She expected him to scoff, to demand a manager, to act like every other wealthy, entitled guest who wandered into her space. Instead, the man let out a low, quiet sound. It took Naomi a moment to realize it was a chuckle. He didn't leave. He stepped closer, the faint scent of sandalwood and expensive clean soap cutting through the heavy smell of the damp soil. He reached out, his knuckles brushing against a healthy green leaf she had just polished. "I have found," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the leaf, "that the darkest hours of the night are the only times the world stops demanding things from us." He looked up, locking eyes with her. "My name is Tai Jin." Naomi stared at him. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, as the city wind howled against the reinforced glass. dome above them, entirely unable to reach them. The 3 a.m. encounters became a quiet, unspoken ritual. For the next 3 weeks, whenever the city outside the glass dome was battered by winter winds, Tae-jin would appear on the slate path of the conservatory. He never announced himself. He would simply materialize from the shadows, smelling of sandalwood and insomnia, taking a seat on the wrought iron bench near the weeping figs. Naomi didn't ask why he was there, and he didn't ask why a woman with the hands of an artisan was wearing the uniform of a janitor. They existed in a delicate, suspended reality, shielded by the humidity and the dark. At first, they barely spoke. Tae-jin would watch her work, his dark eyes tracking the precise, practiced movements of her hands as she repotted ferns and pruned the orchids. Naomi found his presence unnerving at first, but slowly, the tension bled out of her shoulders. There was no judgment in his silence. It was the silence of a man who was also seeking refuge. On the 4th week, the heating system in the conservatory malfunctioned, dropping the ambient temperature to a bone-chilling 50 degrees. Naomi sat on an overturned plastic bucket in the utility closet, her teeth chattering, wrapping her raw hands around a battered steel thermos. The door creaked open. Tae-jin stood in the frame, wearing a heavy cashmere overcoat. "You are shivering," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Brilliant deduction," Naomi muttered, too tired to summon any politeness. She unscrewed the cap of the thermos, pouring a steaming, dark amber liquid into the cup. Tae-jin stepped into the cramped, bleach-scented closet, the sheer size of him making the small space feel entirely breathless. He looked at the steaming cup. "What is that?" "Tea," Naomi said. "It does not smell like standard hotel issue." "It's not. It's mine." Naomi hesitated. The recipe was the only thing Clara hadn't been able to steal, because it existed only in Naomi's mind. It was a complex blend of roasted chicory, dried plum, crushed cardamom, and a rare fermented black leaf she sourced privately. It was the tea that had put the Marigold Room on the map. She looked at Tae-jin. His face was drawn, shadows pooling beneath his eyes. He looked as cold and as hollow as she felt. Without overthinking it, Naomi reached into her tote bag, pulled out a spare paper cup, and poured a measure of the dark liquid. She held it out to him. Tae-jin took it, his long fingers brushing against hers. His skin was warm, a stark contrast to her freezing hands. He brought the cup to his face, closing his eyes as he inhaled the steam. A subtle shift occurred in his posture. The rigid line of his spine softened. He took a slow sip. Naomi watched him, suddenly terrified. For 30 years, her worth had been tied to the reactions of people tasting her creations. Tae-jin opened his eyes. They were wide, the stoic mask completely shattered. "This," he breathed, looking down at the cheap paper cup as if it held liquid gold. The astringency of the chicory is perfectly neutralized by the plum, and the heat at the back of the throat. Cardamom. Naomi's breath hitched. "Yes, I have traveled the world," Tae-jin said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have drank tea in the private gardens of Kyoto and the high mountains of Yunnan. I have never tasted anything with this much soul." He looked at her, his gaze piercing right through her navy uniform, right through her age, right into the very core of her. "Who are you, Naomi?" The sound of her name on his lips sent a sudden, violent jolt of electricity down her spine. No one had said her name like that in years, not as a worker, not as a casualty, but as a woman of immense, undeniable value. "I'm nobody," she whispered, looking down at her scarred hands. "Just a ghost haunting a greenhouse." "Ghosts do not bleed," Tae-jin said softly, reaching out. He gently took her left hand, turning it palm up. His thumb brushed over the raised silvery burn scars on her inner wrist, the permanent tattoos of a lifetime spent navigating industrial ovens. "These are the marks of a creator, a master." Naomi's throat tight closed. The sheer, overwhelming weight of being seen, truly seen, after months of agonizing invisibility, made her eyes burn with unshed tears. She didn't pull her hand away. For 10 minutes in that cramped utility closet, listening to the hum of the broken heater, she let herself believe that life still held pockets of mercy. But hope is a dangerous, fragile thing in the hands of the broken. 2 nights later, the illusion shattered. Naomi arrived for her midnight shift to find the 14th floor in absolute chaos. The usually empty hallways were swarming with men in dark suits, earpieces curled tightly around their lobes. The hotel's general manager, a man who usually never stayed past 5 p.m., was sweating profusely, pacing in front of the conservatory doors. "You!" the manager snapped, spotting Naomi. "Get your gear out of sight. The chairman has called an impromptu structural inspection of the top floors. If he sees so much as a dead leaf, I will fire you before you can blink. Get in the back utility corridor and do not come out." Naomi shrank back, her heart hammering against her ribs. She grabbed her supply cart and practically threw herself into the narrow, fluorescent-lit service hallway, peering out through the small wire mesh window of the swinging door. The elevator doors at the end of the hall dinged. A phalanx of executives stepped out, moving with synchronized, terrified precision. They parted like the Red Sea, bowing their heads in deep, deferential respect. From the center of the formation emerged the chairman. Naomi's breath completely stopped. It was Tae-jin. He was not wearing the relaxed trousers and unbuttoned shirts of their 3 a.m. meetings. He was wearing a devastatingly sharp, 3-piece midnight blue suit that screamed obscene, untouchable wealth. His silver hair was perfectly styled. His jaw was set in a line of absolute, terrifying authority. The structural integrity of this dome was supposed to be reinforced in Q3. Tae-jin's voice whipped through the hall, cold, sharp, and entirely devoid of the warmth she knew. It was the voice of a billionaire who commanded empires. "If the heating failure damages the imported flora, the cost will be deducted from your executive bonuses. Am I understood?" "Yes, Chairman Ryu," the men echoed in unison. Naomi stumbled back from the door, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Chairman Ryu. Ryu Tae-jin. The legendary founder of the Ryu Hospitality Group, a conglomerate that owned half the luxury real estate on the eastern seaboard. A hot, sickening wave of humiliation washed over her. Clara's voice, a poisonous echo from the past, slithered into her mind. "You really thought you were special, Naomi? You're just naive." She had sat in a closet wearing a stained uniform, sharing cheap paper cups of tea with a man whose net worth rivaled small countries. He wasn't a lonely soul seeking refuge. He was the owner of the hotel. He owned the floor she stood on, the uniform she wore, and the miserable paycheck she lived on. He had been slumming it. He was a god playing at being human, amusing himself with the tragic, broken cleaning woman. The physical sensation of shame was so violent, it made her nauseous. Naomi slid down the concrete wall of the service corridor, pulling her knees to her chest. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the tears leaked out anyway, hot and agonizing. She felt entirely 63. She felt entirely destitute. And for the second time in a year, she felt entirely, utterly foolish for trusting someone. For an entire week, Naomi became a ghost. She altered her maintenance routes, moving through the hotel like a shadow. When 3 a.m. approached, she locked herself in the sub-basement boiler room, breathing in the smell of ozone and damp concrete, ignoring the aching dread in her stomach. She knew Tae-jin was looking for her. The head housekeeper complained about the chairman wandering the 14th floor in the middle of the night, demanding to know where the night shift botanist was. Naomi instructed the scheduling manager to say she had been reassigned, but a man who builds empires does not easily accept closed doors. It was 4:15 a.m. on a Thursday. Naomi was sitting at the chipped plastic table in the employee break room. The fluorescent lights flickered violently, casting a sickly green pallor over the peeling linoleum. She was staring blankly at a stale vending machine pastry, her joints screaming from a double shift. The heavy metal door of the break room didn't just open. It swung wide with a forceful, heavy thud. Naomi flinched. Tae-jin stood in the doorway. He looked magnificent and furious. He was wearing a charcoal tuxedo, the bow tie undone and hanging loose around. His neck, clearly having just walked out of a high society gala. The harsh break room lights highlighted the deep, angry tension in his jaw. He stepped inside, letting the door slam shut behind him. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "You lied," Tae-jin said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated the plastic cups on the counter. Naomi slowly stood up, pushing her chair back. The adrenaline burned away her exhaustion. She wasn't going to cower. She had lost everything. She had nothing left to protect but her pride. "I lied?" Naomi fired back, her voice cracking like a whip. "I am exactly what I appear to be. a night shift laborer making $12 an hour. You are the one who forgot to mention you own the building, the air, and my paycheck. Chairman. Tae-jin crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping inches from the plastic table that separated them. He smelled of rain, expensive champagne, and raw panic. I omitted my title because in that greenhouse, I didn't want to be the chairman. I just wanted to be a man drinking tea with a woman who made me feel like I could finally breathe. Well, congratulations, Naomi sneered, her voice thick with unshed tears. You got your poverty tourism. Now go back to your penthouse. Tae-jin's eyes flashed with a dark primal intensity. He slammed his hand down on the table, making Naomi jump. But he didn't raise his voice. When he spoke, it was deadly quiet. Do you think I am playing a game with you? He whispered, his eyes locked onto hers. He reached inside his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a thick, glossy folder. He threw it onto the table. It landed with a heavy slap. Look at it. Naomi stared at the folder. Her hands were trembling. She reached out and flipped open the cover. The air vanished from the room. It was a highly classified corporate prospectus. Stamped across the top in bold gold lettering was RYU Hospitality Group, Acquisition Initiative. Beneath it was a photograph. It was a picture of the Marigold Room. And standing in front of it, wearing a designer suit that Naomi's sweat had paid for, was Clara, smiling her perfect venomous smile. The headline read, National Franchise Partnership, bringing the Marigold Room to every major city. The room began to spin. The harsh smell of stale coffee and ozone merged into a sickening cocktail. Naomi gripped the edge of the plastic table to keep from collapsing. The pain wasn't just a loop, it was a noose, pulling tighter, choking the life out of her all over again. Clara wasn't just thriving, she was expanding, and the man Naomi had begun to fall for was the one funding the knife in her back. You, Naomi gasped, staring at Tae-jin in absolute horror. You're buying her out. You're giving her an empire. I am a businessman, Naomi, Tae-jin said, his voice tight. My acquisitions team found the most profitable botanical tea house in the region. The deal has been in motion for months. I didn't know the owner. He stepped around the table, closing the distance between them. He pointed a long finger at the prospectus. But yesterday, they brought me the proprietary flavor profile analysis of the tea they plan to mass produce. Tae-jin looked up, his dark eyes blazing with a fierce, terrifying light. Plum, chicory, cardamom, fermented black leaf. Naomi froze. I recognize the soul, Tae-jin whispered, stepping so close she could feel the heat radiating off his chest. I tasted it in a paper cup in a freezing utility closet. I ran a background check on Clara. I found a string of highly suspicious LLC transfers dated during a time when medical records show you were hospitalized. He reached out, his large warm hands gently grasping her shoulders. The grip was grounding, keeping her tethered to the earth. They told my board you were a disgruntled former employee who went crazy, Tae-jin said, his voice shaking with a suppressed, violent rage. But I know the hands of a creator. Clara is a parasite. You are the architect. Naomi looked away, a tear finally escaping and tracing a hot path down her cheek. It doesn't matter, she choked out. She has the legal paperwork. She has the patents. I have nothing. I am 63 years old, Tae-jin. I don't have the time or the money to fight a billionaire conglomerate. If you sign that paper tomorrow, my legacy is dead. She tried to pull away from him, her defense mechanisms building a steel wall around her heart. I don't need your pity. Just fire me and let me disappear. Tae-jin's grip on her shoulders tightened. He didn't let her go. He forced her to look at him. I do not deal in pity, Tae-jin said, his voice dropping to a register of pure, unfiltered authority that sent a shiver down her spine. I deal in equity, and I deal in retribution. He reached up, his thumb gently wiping the tear from her cheek. His touch was so tender, it felt like a brand. Who said I was going to sign the contract? He murmured, his eyes locking onto hers with a devastating, protective heat. I am inviting you to the final board meeting tomorrow at noon, not as my employee, but as my personal executive advisor. Naomi stared at him, her heart slamming against her ribs. Tae-jin! She has an army of lawyers. Let her, Tae-jin said, a dark predatory smile curling the corner of his mouth. She has lawyers. You have a dragon. The executive boardroom of the Ryu Hospitality Group occupied the entire top floor of the tallest skyscraper in the city. The walls were made of floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a dizzying, godlike view of the sprawling metropolis below. The room smelled of polished mahogany, expensive leather, and quiet, ruthless power. At the long obsidian table sat 8 board members, their Mont Blanc pens resting beside crystal water glasses. At the far end sat Clara. She looked radiant, practically vibrating with smug triumph, wearing a cream-colored Chanel suit. Spread before her was a $50 million acquisition contract awaiting the final signature. At the head of the table sat Chairman Ryu Tai-jin. He was an imposing monolith in a bespoke black suit, his silver hair catching the morning light. His face was a mask of absolute, unreadable calm. "Chairman," Clara purred, flashing her brightest, most heavily practiced smile, "my legal team has reviewed the final addendums. I believe we are ready to finalize the transition and begin the nationwide rollout." Tae-jin picked up his pen. He tapped it once against the glass table. The sound echoed sharply in the cavernous room. "There is one final matter regarding the intellectual property," Tae-jin said smoothly, his voice echoing with cold authority. "My chief executive advisor has flagged an anomaly in your initial LLC restructuring." Clara's smile stiffened slightly. "I assure you, Chairman, my paperwork is bulletproof." "We shall see," Tae-jin said. He pressed a button under the table. The heavy double oak doors at the back of the boardroom swung open. Naomi walked in. She was not wearing the scratchy navy uniform of a janitor. She was wearing a tailored, deep crimson suit. She had pawned her late mother's diamond earrings to buy it that morning, refusing Tae-jin's offer to pay. She needed this armor to be her own. Her natural hair was styled in a sharp, elegant crown. She walked with her spine straight, her chin held high, moving with the quiet, lethal dignity of a queen returning from exile. The color instantly, violently drained from Clara's face. She gripped the edge of the table, her manicured nails digging into the wood. What is she doing here? Chairman, this woman is a disturbed former employee." "Silence!" Tae-jin snapped. The word cracked through the room like a whip. Even the board members flinched. Tae-jin gestured to the empty leather chair to his immediate right. "Naomi, please." Naomi walked the length of the room. She didn't look at Clara. She didn't look at the board members. She felt the terrifying roar of blood in her ears, but she focused entirely on Tae-jin. He gave her a single, imperceptible nod. A silent transfer of absolute power. Naomi sat down. She placed a worn, leather-bound notebook onto the pristine glass table. "This," Naomi said, her voice steady, low, and vibrating with 35 years of authority, "is the original, handwritten botanical log for the Marigold Room. It contains dated soil samples, supplier receipts from 1989, and the exact, unaltered proprietary formulas for the teas you are attempting to sell today." She slid the notebook down the table. It stopped precisely in front of Clara. "Furthermore," Naomi continued, her eyes finally locking onto the pale, trembling face of the woman who had betrayed her. "When you filed the LLC restructuring 6 months ago, you forged my signature on the asset forfeiture page. A forensic handwriting analyst, contracted by Ryu Hospitality at 4 a.m. this morning, confirmed the tremor pattern does not match my medical records from that date. It is a Class 2 felony." Clara opened her mouth, stammering, looking frantically around the room for an ally. "This is absurd! Chairman, she's lying. She's destitute." Tae-jin leaned forward, steepling his fingers. The predatory darkness in his eyes was terrifying to behold. "Ryu Hospitality does not conduct business with thieves," he said quietly. "The deal is dead." Clara gasped, springing to her feet. "You can't do this. I have contracts." "You have a summons," Tae-jin corrected, his voice dropping to a glacial chill. "My legal team has already contacted the district attorney regarding the fraud. I suggest you use your remaining funds to hire a very good defense attorney. Security will escort you out." 2 men in dark suits immediately materialized behind Clara. The transition from triumphant CEO to utterly humiliated fraud took exactly 3 minutes. As she was escorted out, Clara shot one final venomous look at Naomi, but Naomi simply turned her head, sipping from the crystal water glass. Clara was already a ghost. An hour later, the boardroom was entirely empty. The afternoon sun cast long, golden, slanting shadows across the mahogany floor. The massive city below looked peaceful from this height. Naomi stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, Looking out over the skyline, her heart was finally beating at a normal rhythm. The crushing weight that had sat on her chest for 6 months was gone. She had her business back. She had her life back. But as she looked at the sprawling empire of glass and steel, she realized something profound. Empires are cold. Survival is an instinct, but living requires warmth. She heard the soft, familiar clink of ceramic behind her. Naomi turned. Tae-jin was standing by a side table. He had discarded his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves, revealing his scarred forearms. He was holding 2 porcelain teacups, steam rising into the golden light. He held one out to her. Naomi walked over and took it. Her fingers brushed against his. The spark of electricity was just as intense as it had been in the utility closet. She took a sip. It was her blend. Plum, chicory, cardamom. "What now?" Tae-jin asked softly, his dark eyes searching hers. "You have your kingdom back. You are a wealthy woman again." Naomi looked down at the tea, then up at the man who had seen her when the rest of the world had turned off the lights. She thought about her aching knees, her 63 years of life, the betrayals she had survived, and the profound, terrifying beauty of a second chance. "Running an empire is exhausting work," Naomi said, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face. "I think I might need a partner, someone who knows how to prune a monstera without killing the roots." Tae-jin's stoic mask, finally, completely broke. He smiled, a breathtaking, boyish smile that erased 20 years from his face. He stepped closer, taking the teacup from her hand and setting it on the table. He reached out, weaving his fingers through hers, pulling her gently against his chest. "I happen to be very good with roots," Tae-jin whispered, leaning down, his lips hovering mere inches from hers. "And I have the rest of my life to prove it to you." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, amber glow over the two of them, Naomi closed her eyes and let herself be held. She wasn't too old, she wasn't invisible, she was just beginning. We spend so much of our lives believing that our story has an expiration date, that after a certain age or a certain heartbreak, our best chapters are permanently behind us. But what if your greatest betrayal was simply the universe clearing the stage for your most beautiful beginning? If you were handed a blank page today, right now, what would you write on it?